24 years old, the only heir of one of the richest empires in the world, dies, not in war, not because of a long illness, but in just 15 seconds in the sky. That person is the son of Aristotle Onassis, a young man born into power, raised among money, yachts, and the most powerful people on the planet. A life that anyone looking at would think is perfect. But behind it all was a childhood arranged, a life controlled, and a journey trying to escape the overwhelming shadow of his own father. So what really happened? Why did the man who was supposed to inherit an entire empire end his life in a way no one expected? And why even the money and power of Onassis could not save his own son? On April 30th, 1948, at Columbia University Medical Center in New York, Alexander Socrates Onassis let out his first cry. It was not an ordinary day for a family. At the very moment the baby was born, his father, Aristotle Onassis, was not in the hospital corridor. He was sitting in his office, busy signing major shipping contracts to expand his fleet of oil tankers. From the very first moment, Alexander was not just a child. He was born as the one who would carry on an entire empire. Aristotle named his son Alexander to honor his own brother, who had been hanged during the bloody events in Smyrna in 1922. At that time, Aristotle was already a man of great ambition. He had come from nothing, once forced to flee from the flames of war. He wanted his son to be strong, to continue and go far beyond what he himself had achieved. From a young age, Alexander lived in the glow of his family's prominence. The first images of him in the press were not scenes of playing and laughing with friends, but pictures of a boy standing solemnly beside major politicians and businessmen. In 1953, at just 5 years old, Alexander was taken to the christening ceremony of the ship Tina Onassis, a vessel named after his mother. The global media at the time saw him as a future prince of a maritime dynasty. Everything around Alexander was carefully calculated with money and power. His father was not only building a shipping company, he was building a legend, and Alexander was at the center of that legend. But behind the elegant photographs, with spotless white clothing, Alexander's childhood lacked the simplest things. It was not the childhood of an ordinary child, but more like a plan that had been laid out from a very early age. Alexander's life from an early age was surrounded by luxury. He grew up among lavish mansions in Paris, Monaco, New York, and on constant trips aboard the yacht Christina, a ship that had once been a war vessel and was transformed into a floating palace on the water. But behind all that luxury were large emotional voids. His father, Aristotle, was rarely present at important moments in his children's lives. He was always busy with business deals and his own romantic affairs. Alexander and his sister Christina were raised by Swiss tutors, studied at the most expensive boarding schools in Europe, and were required to master up to 7 languages. They could speak with anyone in the world, but even in their own home, the 2 siblings often faced only silence and strict rules. There were rarely warm embraces or words of comfort from their parents. His mother, Athena Livanos, a beautiful but fragile woman, gradually withdrew into her own world. She lived in sadness and resignation as she witnessed her marriage with Aristotle increasingly fall apart. The first major event that truly changed Alexander's life occurred in 1960, when he had just turned 12 years old. His parents officially divorced after years of public conflict. For Alexander, it was a heavy shock. He had to watch his family fall apart right before his eyes. What was even more painful was that afterward, his mother remarried Stavros Niarchos, his father's biggest business rival. From then on, Alexander was caught between the 2 most powerful men in Greece, who were in fierce opposition. He had to move constantly between schools in Switzerland, villas in Monaco, and business offices. No matter where he was, he felt that he was only a pawn in the game of adults. It was during that difficult period that Alexander began to learn to stay silent and observe more. He no longer tried to please his father. He built a protective shell for himself. And then his rebellion gradually became clear as he entered his teenage years. But it was not the kind of loud, outward defiance. It was a quiet rejection, growing stronger over time. At the age of 16, Alexander failed an exam at a prestigious high school in Paris. This result made Aristotle extremely angry. He saw it as an insult to the entire Onassis family. Immediately, Alexander was brought back to Monaco and forced to work in the offices of the corporation under an extremely strict regime. Even as the only heir, he was paid only a symbolic salary of $12,000 per year. He had to sit and do tedious paperwork under the close supervision of employees loyal to his father. Every day, Alexander still wore a neat suit to the office, but his eyes always carried a distant and indifferent look. He was in no hurry to prove himself as a true Onassis, as his father expected. Instead of caring about massive oil tankers or profit figures, Alexander spent hours tinkering with engines and studying mechanical engineering. He searched for a clear and simple logic, something he could not find in his father's world of calculated business. He also began to assert his independence through relationships that Aristotle strongly opposed, especially his relationship with Odile Rodin, a French actress older than him and the widow of a well-known figure. For Alexander, these mature women brought a sense of independence and authenticity that he had never experienced within his family. The relationship between father and son became even more tense when Aristotle decided to marry Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of the President of the United States, in 1968. Alexander did not hide his dissatisfaction. He once made a famous remark, "My father loves names, and Jackie loves money." He saw this marriage as the clearest proof of the emptiness in the world his father was building, a world where even love was only a transaction to elevate status. From that point on, Alexander became even more determined in refusing every attempt by his father to mold him into a hardened successor. He did not want to become a copy of Aristotle. He did not want to live as a moving shadow of his father. Instead, he quietly built a world of his own. A world where the name Onassis was no longer a burden on his shoulders. He chose to walk his own path with a humble but very firm attitude. While the whole world looked at him and saw a prince standing at the peak of wealth, Alexander felt that he was threatened by his father's wealth every day. He lived among the most luxurious comforts, but his mind was always searching for a way out. He spent his time on technical interests, on private trips, and on his own silent thoughts. Alexander grew up with a chronic sense of instability. He always feared that anything could be taken away with a single gesture from his father. For that reason, his quiet rebellion was not to oppose his father, but to find a real place for himself amid the overwhelming prominence of his family. For Alexander Onassis, life on the ground felt suffocating. Every step he took was overshadowed by the enormous presence of his father. The oil business schemes, the heavy expectations from one of the richest men in the world made it hard for him to breathe. The only way for Alexander to feel light and find himself was to leave the ground and rise into the sky. In 1967, he began his first flying lessons. For Alexander, the sky was not a luxurious pastime of a rich young man. It was a serious career, his true purpose in life. He spent thousands of hours tirelessly in the cockpit. He accumulated more than 1,500 flight hours, a number enough to prove that he was a truly capable pilot, not just a young man who only knew how to enjoy himself. Although his imperfect eyesight prevented him from obtaining a heavy aircraft pilot license, Alexander still passed and earned a commercial pilot license. Thanks to that, he was allowed to operate light aircraft and air taxi planes. By 1971, his father, Aristotle Onassis, appointed him as president of Olympic Aviation, the subsidiary responsible for regional flights of the family's group. But Alexander was not the type of person who just sat in an air-conditioned office signing papers. He was truly a craftsman of the sky. Most of his time was spent at the maintenance hangar and Hellinikon Airport in Athens. He personally checked every part of the engine, carefully studied every technical diagram, and memorized all flight maps. He liked to sit and talk with pilots and mechanics about technical specifications and real problems of aircraft. He rarely attended the luxurious parties of the upper class, where people only talked about oil prices and billion-dollar deals. Alexander once said a sentence that made many people stop and reflect. "Up there, no one asks me what my name is, they only care whether I know how to fly." For him, the cockpit was the fairest place in the world. The name Onassis meant nothing if he did not have real ability. When sitting in the cockpit, the smell of fuel and engine oil was no longer the smell of money. It was the smell of absolute freedom. At that moment, he was no longer the son of Onassis. He was simply a pilot, a man in control of his own fate. However, there was something that troubled Aristotle Onassis even more than his son being absorbed in flying. It was when Alexander found a love that the wealth of the entire Onassis empire could not buy or control. Imagine a young man in his 20s falling deeply in love with a woman 16 years older than him. That was Fiona Campbell Walter, a divorced baroness raising 2 children. Fiona carried an aristocratic beauty and independence, and she had once been a friend of Alexander's mother. For Aristotle, this relationship was not a romantic story. It was an open rebellion. He used every means to separate them. He gave his son a $2 million villa near Athens, hoping to lure Alexander away from Fiona. He applied banking pressure on her family and even threatened to disinherit his son. But for the first time in his life, Alexander stood up straight and confronted the giant. He refused every expensive gift from his father. He affirmed that his dignity was not something to be bargained. Fiona, a woman who did not need the money of the Onassis family, advised him not to accept anything that he did not earn himself. Alexander listened. He used only his modest salary of $12,000 a year from his office job to buy gifts for the woman he loved. In a world where everything seemed to be purchasable with blank checks, the love between Alexander and Fiona was like a rare light. Their loyalty and understanding were placed above all else. Alexander did not look for a wife to decorate the family profile. He sought a woman who saw his true self, who stood beside him not because of oil tankers, but because of his heart. This relationship transformed Alexander from a passive heir into a man who dared to stand up and fight for his own happiness. However, Alexander's struggle for freedom and love led to an extremely painful ending. On the afternoon of January 22, 1973, at Hellinikon Airport in Athens, the sky was overcast. Alexander stepped into the cockpit of a Piaggio P136L2 amphibious aircraft. He was accompanied by 2 people, Donald McCusker, a pilot he was instructing, and Donald McGregor, the family's private pilot. Alexander did not know that during a previous maintenance, a serious mistake had been made. The control cables of the wings had been installed in reverse. This meant that when he pulled the control to the left, the aircraft tilted to the right and vice versa. This was an error that no flying experience could overcome, because every instinctive reaction became incorrect. At exactly 3:30 p.m., the engine roared. The aircraft sped down the runway and began to take off. But only a few seconds later, just after leaving the ground and flying at a height of only a few dozen meters, the accident occurred. The right wing suddenly collapsed downward. In those exact 15 brief seconds, Alexander tried with all his strength to control the aircraft. But the more he tried, the more the plane plunged violently toward the ground. A horrifying crash echoed. Metal twisted, glass shattered, fuel spilled across the runway. When the rescue team pulled Alexander from the wreckage, the scene was heartbreaking. Alexander was taken immediately into the emergency room. His skull was severely fractured, his brain critically damaged. Over the next 33 hours, everyone witnessed a race against death. This time, money could no longer do much. Aristotle refused to accept the truth. He turned the hospital into a command center. He ordered private planes to fly through the night to London, Boston, and Paris to bring in the best neurosurgeons in the world. He spent enormous sums purchasing the most advanced medical equipment available at the time. But the readings from the machines still showed a terrifying result. The father who had once been powerful, who had controlled an entire empire, now collapsed to his knees on the hospital floor. He prayed in ancient Greek, the language of the poor farmers he had left behind long ago. Aristotle wept and promised to give up all his wealth, all his oil tankers, if only his son could keep breathing. However, the renowned British neurosurgeon Alan Richardson, after careful examination, told him directly Alexander's brain had completely died. There was no chance of recovery. On the evening of January 23, 1973, Aristotle had to make the most painful decision of his life. He signed the papers allowing the doctors to withdraw life support. Alexander Onassis died at the age of 24. At that very moment, Aristotle Onassis also collapsed. He walked out of the hospital like a man without a soul, his eyes red from lack of sleep and pain. After Alexander's death, Aristotle Onassis never stood up again. He gradually lost the motivation to live and to fight. The disease myasthenia gravis began to attack him. This is an illness that causes the muscles to weaken and lose strength. The image of Aristotle in his final years was deeply sad. To keep his eyes open while speaking to others in meetings, he had to use tape to hold his eyelids up because they no longer had the strength to open on their own. 2 years later, in March 1975, Aristotle passed away at a hospital in Paris due to complications from pneumonia. He left behind an enormous fortune, but there was no longer a man in the family to inherit it. Christina Onassis, the only remaining daughter, became the heir. At the age of 24, she became one of the richest women in the world, with an estimated $500 million. But that money did not bring her happiness. Christina tried to fill the emptiness inside her with 4 marriages. She married Joseph Bolker, Alexandros Andreadis, Sergei Kauzov, and finally Thierry Roussel. However, all of these marriages ended in pain. These men seemed to care more about the Onassis fortune than about Christina herself. She fell deeper and deeper into depression. She used sleeping pills and weight loss drugs to forget the pain of losing her brother and her father. In 1988, at the age of 37, Christina was found dead in a bathtub in Argentina due to acute pulmonary edema. Within less than 15 years, 3 generations of the Onassis family had passed away. Alexander died at 24, Aristotle at 69, Christina at 37. All of it left an enormous fortune to a 3-year-old girl, Athena Onassis. Athena Onassis, the final heir, chose a completely different life to escape the tragedies of her family. She grew up in Switzerland, away from the luxury in Greece, and spent much of her time on equestrian sports, her true passion. In 2013, Athena made a symbolic decision. She sold the island of Scorpios to a Russian billionaire for more than $100 million. The island, which had once been the burial place of Alexander, Aristotle, and Christina, now belongs to someone else. That is the clearest sign that the Onassis empire has completely collapsed. The only legacy that remains is the Alexander S. Onassis Foundation. Aristotle established this foundation to honor his son. 45% of the family's assets are used to support culture and education. The story of Alexander Onassis leaves us with a simple but very clear lesson. You can buy many things with money. You can own massive fleets of oil tankers. You can control entire markets. But you cannot buy peace of mind, and you cannot buy even a single moment of truly living beside the people you love. Alexander spent his whole life trying to escape his father's shadow. In the end, he found freedom in the very place he loved most, in the sky. The Onassis Empire is now only a part of history. It reminds us that no matter how wealthy you are, it does not guarantee happiness. Sometimes the most luxurious things become the heaviest burdens in a person's life. Now only the sound of the Aegean Sea waves remains, whispering around the graves on the island of Scorpios, where Alexander, Aristotle, and Christina rest in peace.